is Honors Algebra 2 Pre-Calculus. We're doing section 9.1 in Pre-Calc, which is sequences and series. Our last video talked about factorial. Right now we're going to talk about where a factorial falls in order of operations. So there's no F in order of operations, right? We've got PEMDAS, there's no F. Think of a factorial as roughly an exponent. Like that's where it falls in order of operations. It lives where the exponents live. So for instance, 2n factorial, like the number 2 and then an n factorial, because my factorial is an exponent, that's how I'm treating it. It's not actually exponential, but I'm treating it like an exponent. That means that this happens first in order of operations. The n factorial happens first. So I would find n factorial, which would be n times n minus 1 times all the numbers down to 1. And then whatever I'd get after I find n factorial, I would double it, right? I would times it by 2, right? That's very different than what happens if I have a 2n quantity in a factorial. So 2n quantity factorial means that the first number in the factorial is 2n, and the next number is 1 lower than that, so 2n minus 1, and then the next number would be 2n minus 2, and then 2n minus 3, all the way until I get down to 1. So that can be a little bit hard to grasp at first, so I thought I'd show you an example with numbers. So let's do 2 times 3 factorial versus the quantity 2 times 3 factorial. So 2 times 3 factorial means a 2 is sitting in front of a 3 factorial, right? The factorial would come before multiplication because e is before m. So what would happen is this is a 2 times, in parentheses, my 3 factorial, right? So that's a 2 times my 3 factorial. Well, we've already established that a 3 factorial is a 6, right? So this is a 2 times a 6. So 2 times 3 factorial is a 12, right? 2 times 6. But if I do 2 times 3 quantity in parentheses, right, and then do a factorial, well, the parentheses come first, right? Parentheses come before exponents. So this is actually a 6 factorial, right? I do the multiplication that's inside the parentheses first and get 6 factorial. Well, that means 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. We've already established in the last example that 5 factorial was a 120, so I'm just timesing that by 6, so I get a 720. Notice these are very different numbers, right? 720 is very different than 12. Another thing worth noticing here is that fairly small numbers, if you do the factorial of those numbers, like 6 is not a big number, but 6 factorial is already a 720. If you were to do, let's say, 10 factorial, you would get something in the 3 millions, right? So fairly small numbers, when you do a factorial to them, you get a very large result.